these are examples of institutions, mostly innovations, but not all. Some are old institutions that we can build and cultivate and expand inside of a capitalist society, but which embody anti-capitalist values, which prefigure an alternative to capitalism, and which, if they could expand in scope and scale, would constitute the growth of an alternative to capitalism within capitalism itself. Now that if is a big if, that's the strategic problem. Can you imagine transforming capitalism by undermining its central mechanisms through the expansion of alternatives inside of it? This is my list. I'm not going to talk about all of these. Let's begin with worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives are in some ways the oldest real utopia within capitalism. In the 19th century, in a famous, if ill-tempered debate between Proudhon and Marx, the centerpiece of their fight was over the status of worker cooperatives within capitalism. And Proudhon figured that because this would be so much more desirable, both because workers wouldn't be exploited by outside owners, but also because it would be a much more desirable workplace, collaborative, cooperative, that once worker cooperatives got off the ground, workers would simply refuse to work in capitalist firms. And there'd be basically this problem that capitalism would face a chronic labor supply shortage because workers would always operate in worker cooperatives. In order to get workers to work for capitalist firms, they'd have to pay such high wages that they wouldn't be competitive. You know, it's a nice fantasy. Marx said this is ridiculous. There's no way this could possibly happen. Of course, history seems to vindicate Marx on this. Worker cooperatives exist everywhere, but in niches, in small corners. And he saw the obstacle not being any economic problem with them competing effectively with capitalist firms, but rather the capitalists simply wouldn't allow them to. It was the political power of capitalism which would destroy them, and therefore the political power of capitalism of capitalists that had to be defeated, but not something intrinsic to the economic mechanisms per se. Well, be that as it may, worker cooperatives still do embody alternative principles to some of the features of capitalism, particularly around the organization of the workplace, the nature of exploitation, and above all, the democratization of the firm under way more egalitarian conditions than occur in capitalist firms. If I just came to you and said, here's the proposal, let's try to get 300,000 or 400,000 people around the world to cooperate to produce an encyclopedia without paying them anything, and make it free to anybody in the world, and then let's try to encourage other languages to do it, so eventually within a decade or so, 160 languages have at least some Wikipedia. And the English language one, which started first and has the largest spread, will have 4.5 million entries, and it will destroy a 300-year-old capitalist market in encyclopedias. What do you think? Is this going to work? Of course, it can't work. It's impossible. It's a fantastically good example about how the limits of possibility are just so difficult to understand when there is some foundationally different way of doing things, in this case because of the possibility of collaboration, P2P, peer-to-peer collaboration, that's opened up by Internet and the globalization of Internet. It's also, in another sense, it's the positive side of globalization. This is a global product produced by people in hundreds of different countries collaboratively, and it's pretty good. It's not perfect. In fact, in some ways, it's ragged, it's messy, but it's pretty good. I use it all the time, and when I use it on topics I don't know anything about, and then I follow some of the links, you discover all sorts of things. Here's another open source, peer-to-peer, global commons product, Linux, beats hands down its capitalist rivals. Operating system that is the foundation of operating systems all over the world, produced in a non-proprietary way, no private property in it, nobody's paid to do it. Well, that's not quite true actually any longer. What's happened is Google and some other large high-tech companies realized
that Linux was better than anything they could buy on the market, and therefore they had an interest in making it better. It's so good that the biggest capitalist corporations in the world have to devote their resources to enhancing something that's in the commons, that's in the universally accessible, unprivately appropriatable domain of knowledge. Now, there's a dark side to that, too, and that's part of real utopias as well. Their interfacing with capitalism both means enhancement in some circumstances, and I think Linux is enhanced by the energies of very high-powered Google employees trying to improve it. Well, contradictions cannot be avoided. In places like Detroit, very substantial tracts of land are being reconfigured for growing food. The question is under whose terms and for what purposes. So battles are emerging over the nature of the property rights around urban agriculture. And one solution is the creation of new forms of land trusts that take land out of the market, create community boards with restrictive potential uses around farming, community gardens, and the like, and then creating a more democratic and embedded way in which this land can be used. In Madison, Wisconsin, there's a wonderful community garden land trust development that also includes social housing, well, co-housing. It's not quite what I guess in Canada it's called social housing, but it's still a socially underwritten form of housing, which is based on this kind of principle. So what Kickstarter does is says, let's bypass banks, venture capitalists, humanities council grants, and other conventional ways of mobilizing resources for small projects, often in the arts, but also commercial and community-based as this one was, and make appeals to anybody who wants to contribute. Some of them, you get something in return. That is, if the project gets funded, you get something like, a certain number of meals at a restaurant might be what you get if you contribute. But others are really much more donation-based, more than on the logic of a gift economy, where you're giving a gift to a project because you want that project to be in the world, and you will experience the value of that project once it's realized. Kickstarter also, though, has ambiguities. It has a dark side, just like Linux has a dark side. Venture capitalists have now discovered that this is a really good way of trolling new projects and seeing what they might want to actually buy into as investors, not just as Kickstarter participants. So what they apparently have been doing is contributing a few $100s to lots and lots of these, and then see which ones succeed, and then offer the successful ones, venture capitalist investments, to draw it into the full capitalist sector. Well, that's not necessarily such a bad thing given the alternatives and given the array of ways that people can enter the capitalist part of the capitalist market, but it's not the real utopian aspect of Kickstarter. Alternative currencies are something that I haven't at all taken seriously. I thought they were just kind of curiosities on the fringes and didn't in any way constitute a significant kind of real utopian seed or alternative. Then that may still be true in the sense that one can hardly imagine an entire economy being built around the principles of most of the alternative currencies. But they do, I've become convinced, constitute a more interesting site for thinking through alternatives than I had anticipated. I was recently in Hong Kong, and a community center in the Wan Chai district has developed a time bank alternative currency that's denominated in 5-minute units. So this is an hour, this is a sixth of an hour, and so on. When I talked to them, I came and they took me around to the various things, and I talked to them for an hour and a half about real utopias and the like, so they gave me 90 minutes worth of Hong Kong time bank currency. You get currency by performing services. It's for people who are time-rich and cash-poor. Free publicly provided goods, free goods. The best-known example are libraries. Libraries are communist institutions, to each according to need. If you go into a library and only check out books that are really, really expensive because it's the biggest bargain, you get it for free and it costs a lot, but you have no interest in the book, you'd be crazy. You go into a library and you check out books because you need them. And how are they rationed? They're rationed by wait lists, that is, by time. And time in a way that respects the radical equality of all people's time. An hour, a day of a person's life is worth the same no matter who you are. You put on a waiting list. And the length of the waiting list is the signal to the library that new books need to be ordered, if that's the system in which the library can function. Libraries are a radically anti-market, anti-private property way of gaining access to an important kind of resources. I think in the 21st century, free public transportation is going to be a central site of struggle and of demands and of expansion of public goods in spite of neoliberalism, particularly as environmental problems become more pressing. And it's already a bigger reality in the world than you might think. There's a very cool website, freepublictransports.com, that includes lots of information about free public transportation around the world. One place that has for over a decade is Hasselt, the Netherlands. This is a little graph of ridership since they introduced free public transportation. Lest you think this is only in Northern Europe and places like that, the Staten Island ferry in the United States is free public transportation. Doesn't cost anything. Vancouver should have free public transportation. Free public transportation. I think it should be a kind of core demand because it brings together so many different things. The right to the city, the right to mobility, environmental issues. So what do all of these have in common? It's a long heterogeneous list. I think it's pretty obvious. They all embody in varying degrees the values of equality, democracy, community, and sustainability to a greater extent than does capitalism. They all have this character of embodying and realizing these values to a significantly greater degree, and yet they're doable inside of capitalism and potentially point beyond capitalism. Real utopias constitute an alternative to capitalism in part because they can be inserted into a capitalist ecosystem and solve problems within capitalism in one way or another. And yet, if we treat them as an environment around which to struggle to expand their spaces, potentially they can also be corrosive of capitalism. And this leads to the final question. Could the expansion and deepening of these and other real utopia examples ever cumulatively erode the dominance of capitalism? Are they doomed to remain on the fringes in small niches, leaving capitalist power hegemonic? And I don't have an answer to it. But in place of an answer, what I would say is this. I would affirm the opacity of the future limits of possibility. I'm invoking the Wikipedia impossibility theorem. We cannot know in advance how far we can go in building alternatives within capitalism that push us beyond. And even if it is the case that real utopias ultimately are a dead end, that is, if our goal is transforming capitalism because of the harms it imposes on people alive today and people in the future, even if real utopias are not the answer to this puzzle. How do we transform a system like this? In building real utopias in the world as it is, first, you are making lives better in the world as it is. And second, I think it creates a better political ecology, if you will, and the political ecosystem of people's lived experiences and forms of community in which they can form coalitions to engage in the political struggles that might push things further than real utopias can. In any case, it's my best bet, given the failure of ruptural strategies and at least the present exhaustion of the traditional taming strategies of capitalism, that we can perhaps erode capitalism through real utopias. Thank you very much.